And I think understanding the qualities that got handed down to you that make you an awesome person, like to the example you were using, like, I don't think we give enough credit to the environment and the people that raised us. And I know some people listening to this are probably maybe had horrible upbringings, but there's always a thread, a gem in there that made you who you are today.
Yes. Dr. Mindy in the house. All right.
I appreciate that.
The carnivore diet.
Because of what we eat.
Honestly, you've really touched my heart.
This episode of the Resetter podcast is sponsored by REDMOND'S Sea Salt. REDMOND'S is not only pure and unprocessed salt, but it is full of trace minerals. And not only is it going to bring out the best flavor of every bite that you're eating, but it's going to give your body the nutrients it needs to thrive. I'm curious if you know this study. It was one that I actually put in the new book that I'm writing. And it's the longest study ever done on health and happiness. And it was an 80-year study done out of Harvard following, I believe they followed about 50 men, but then they followed their grandchildren as well over 80 years to see what was the number one predictor of health and happiness as you age. Are you familiar with this study?
I'm not, but I'm intrigued and hanging on every word now.
Yeah, he actually has a TED Talk, the lead of the study, because they did it for 80 years. And people actually, in the study, like, of course, people died. They didn't say who, but they said that a couple of presidents were in the study, because the study was started in 1930 with the graduates of Harvard, they were seniors at Harvard. So again, they didn't say who they were, but they followed these men and their grandchildren for 80 years. And here's what they found. The number one predictor of both health and happiness was the quality of your closest relationships. So if you had good relationships with a spouse, if you had good relationships with family or friends, if you had these intimate relationships that you put energy into, it actually made you live longer, made you have less medications, less diseases, and you were happier.
Wow.
Crazy, right?
That's unbelievable. And it also totally supports what I have seen and what I've experienced. But it's also interesting. Like I have not heard that. It's fascinating, but you think about the power and the energy you get from those healthy relationships. I mean, it's like a snowball effect when you have those kind of healthy, strong, communicative relationships with people. It's so powerful in someone's life. That's interesting.
And the other part of that I want to point out, is that we don't look at these relationships as being a health habit. And that is what blows me away is, I'm in Silicon Valley where people are working, I don't even 70, 80 hours a week, and work and life is just all, one big thing. And I also have found myself over the years, with my closest friends and my parents, including, which I want to get into the power of what you're doing with aging parents. But I forget that to stop and realize that just as important as working out is tending to these relationships. So I'm curious let's start with the podcast. And just so my audience knows, you've interviewed some really cool moms of pretty influential people. So I want to start off with that mother relationship. And that's a complicated one. What have you learned from talking to all these moms of famous people?
It has been such a masterclass in parenting. And I will tell you, one of the focuses for me has been I wanted to seek out moms who've raised people that I see to be happy, fulfilled. A lot of them have been famous because it's a little more interesting and everybody kind of starts on the same page. But yeah. I've also interviewed people that aren't famous, and it's the same story as the moms who have well-known children. And what I see time and time again is it is about, supporting the child for who they are, exactly as they are, not putting on, this is who I want you to like the sport because I was good at the sport. It's seeing your child for who they are. loving them like crazy, that love, many moms were just like, I just loved him. I didn't always know what I was doing. I didn't really know how, the ins and outs, the nuts and bolts. I didn't always get those right, but I loved them.
Yep.
And then enabling them to, one of the moms talked about championing her son's abilities. And it's like, you love them for who they are. You don't try to change them. And then you just enable them, and it's kind of like amplifying who they already are. So, they are still, the child is still doing that work, but those are some of the key factors I continued to see time. I've interviewed probably now maybe around 40 parents. But for the podcast specifically, like a Colin O'Brady, who he's had all these world records. He, climbs mountains and like Mount Everest, like, regularly. And he's an incredible person. He's a great book. Jesse Itzler, Sarah Blakely, Kyler Murray, so NFL people, world record holders, billionaires who create an incredible brand, all of them, they've all said some version of those common threads. And it's been really interesting, and it's impacted me as a mom myself. That's how I started this whole journey. Was I'm raising 3 little girls, and I'm like, I want to understand how it's one thing when you're trying to pick out what kind of, diaper to use. It's another thing when you're like, how do I create a child or a person that becomes happy and fulfilled in life and healthy in life? Like that's a different journey than just, the things I can find on Google. And so I wanted to have these conversations with the people that have done it, that I can look at the child and say, your child's 50 and happy and fulfilled and loves you still. And to your point about that, the study is also all the parents that I've interviewed for the podcast, they still have a very close relationship with their kids. It wasn't cool. Like I raised them, but that was, and I didn't seek that out, but it's been an outcome that I've noticed, like, they all still are very close. And whether it's weekly meals or, trips together or whatever, they're all still very close. So that supports that study as well.
Yeah. I would say, my kids are 22 and 19. And we're just sort of having this experience where you are like observing your work. I don't know another way to say that.
Yes. That's such a good way of saying it.
Let's see how my pet project has worked. Is working out.
Will they fly? What is gonna happen here?
Right. Did I totally mess up? And I would say that my husband and I had a very similar philosophy to parenting, which was, I'm not looking to parent kids to fit in. I'm looking to parent kids not necessarily to stand out, but in a world where everybody is trying to fit in, how do I help my kids be their authentic versions of themselves? And a great example that I'll use is that my daughter was super theatrical, and I was like a little tomboy that just wanted to play sports all the time. So I thought I would be the parent that had like a pack of boys. Yep. And instead I got the first one out of the gate was a girl. And not only was she a girl, but she was this prissy girl. And so, or like a really, wanted to dress up all the time. So she got really attached to her Ariel wig that she wore for Halloween and wanted to wear it everywhere, and including the supermarket. And I would be in the car trying to tell her, like, you got to take it off. It's dirty. It's ratted. And she's like, nope. And so it was really interesting as a parent to realize, oh my gosh, that's my stuff. I'm feeling self-conscious to walk into the store with my 4-year-old with this long, bright Ariel wig on. It's really hard as a parent to not control those moments, but what a benefit down the road.
It is that exact story. It is a perfect example. It is a perfect example because I had another mom whose daughter is Shalene Johnson's, who she is.
I know who she is.
Yeah. So I interviewed her mom, and her mom talked almost the whole time about confidence, building her confidence, and she was like, I let my kids wear whatever they wanted to. It was their expression. And another mom, Chad Wright's mom, she said, as long I would let them do anything for self-expression, as long as it wasn't going to hurt them or anybody else.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, but honestly, I was like you, Dr. Mindy, where I was like, really though? Like, are we really going to go into the store with the, with the high heels and the knee socks and the wig and the princess outfit? Are we really going to do that? Like, it's been a lesson for me. Cause I'm like, I don't know. But then to your point, as soon as I was like, oh, that's my stuff. That's my, they are good with it. And what's more empowering for your child, to feel confident or to feel like they're falling? Like I would always choose them to feel confident, and to feel empowered over not. And I mean, that over what? Like what is my big concern? So, but I think that story that you shared is one that's so relatable for so many parents, but it also translates. Like there's a version of that with a 14-year-old, and there's a version of that with a 20-year-old, and I've also learned that parents, like, you're never done. You're never like, no, I'm done, so there's different versions of that and that evolves as the kids get older. And I've heard that from the parents too, because I've interviewed, 80, 90-year-olds of kind of their journey of this. And, they're like, it's still hard when your child has children of their own. Then you're still doing the same things that you did when they were kids. So these lessons continue to show up in our lives time and time again.
Yeah, it's so true. And I will tell you that one thing I've learned having a parenting philosophy of like, okay, all I care about, we felt like there were two things that were really important to us. One was that our kids find their own way. And the other one was that you're a compassionate human, that you show up in a compassionate, loving way that contributes to the world, not takes from the world. And so those were kind of the two themes that continued all the way through. So our daughter's 22 and she got into college, and it was not for her, because the way education is now is it's very like, here's a bunch of information, learn it and then regurgitate it back. And that was so not her. So she bumped around college a little bit until we finally were like, this is not your path. It's okay if it's not your path. And what she's doing now is she's a farrier, where she is shoeing horses. She has a passion for horses. And I told her the other day, I tell you all that to say, I told her the other day, I said, I want you to remember that anytime you try to fit your life into society's mold, you're going to be unhappy. And every time you go in your own lane, you're going to thrive. And I've seen that since the day you were born. And it was like a really cool moment. She's like, thank you for that reminder. So I do think the threads of parenting philosophy that we were raised in show up for us in our adult years. And is that kind of what you saw as the people who they were as adults? Really, it was impacted by the philosophy of the parent.
So it's been really interesting. Yes. I mean, there is certainly part of it where they come to us as they are. Like, your daughter was never going to want to be the sports girl that was, and you saw that, right? You see that pretty, as much as you're like, no. Where'd you come from? How'd that happen? I don't know. Like, what are we doing? Are we going to go to a basketball game? But that was who she was going to be. But then I've also seen with these interviews that the environment does play into who they are. For example, Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, has created this $1 billion brand out of nothing, right? Zero. She started it from nothing. Yeah. Well, I talked to her mom, and one of the things she said, it was so brilliant, and actually got picked up by a lot of different news stations and articles and all this, is she said, Sarah and Ford would come to me and they'd say they were bored. And I would say, you've got toys, go figure it out. And then Sarah became an inventor of one of the greatest inventions of our generation. Honestly, like the most impactful one. I mean, for $1 billion brand, like that's a pretty significant invention. Also, her brother, Ford, started a company that he ended up selling for like $40 million. Also, like, they both have become inventive and taking initiative. And does that happen if they came from a house that always catered to their needs and gave them things to do all the time, and they were in camps and they never had any blank space to just mess around, just to try things? And so Sarah's mom talked about, she listed on the podcast several different things Sarah did. She'd go sell paintings to neighbors that she drew she'd take her little red wagon and go sell paintings. She started like a babysitting thing at a local hotel. The hotel didn't even know it, but she was like, I just could go in there. They'd let me go. And I just take people, people would, I mean, one thing after another. And it was a combination of, like, of course there are things that are natural to who Sarah is, natural to who your daughter is, natural to all of us. But then that environment, the things that those parents really care about and the way that you're raised can really, back to amplifying, it could amplify even more who they are and what they're doing. And it sounds like that's what you're seeing in your child. Like, those things that you guys really cared about are coming out even more in your kids. So, which would have been different if they were raised in a different household. So it's been important for me to understand, like, honor who your child is, but then also know you make an impact, and the things that you care about will come out in their life and could really serve them in a great way when that's coming from that place of love and consistency.
Have you read Mae Musk's autobiography?
I have not.
Elon Musk's mom?
I have not. No, but she is on my list.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't have a connection for you, but she, but she pretty much said the same thing, that her kids were, when they were bored, she would say, I don't, that's your problem, not mine. Figure out what to do. And then look at Elon Musk, so it is really interesting. The other flip side of that, and this ties into the health and happiness study, is then, as we get older, we sort of, that relationship really shifts. And I will tell you, I'm seeing that in my own life with my kids. I'm seeing it with my parents. Like, a lot of my audience they're around my age. And we're in this really unique time where our kids are grown up and out of the house, and our parents are aging and actually have a little bit become like our kids now. Like, my husband and I are trying, as empty nesters, sort of thinking about, well, what do we want to do in this next journey of our lives? And then I go, oh my gosh, wait, I can't go far. I have an 86-year-old dad and an 82-year-old mom, and I need to be close to them because they're aging. What I know the new version of your work that Jesse's thrown you into is the legacy work and interviewing parents as they age. Talk a little bit about that, because I think there's some gems there for us to also understand the power of these relationships.
It is. And what I've noticed, and what I've noticed from my podcast, but then as I'm doing these legacy interviews also, is that nobody's really asking these questions. No one's having these conversations. And our family, regardless of their age, they have your stories. They have your history. They know all of this. And maybe some pieces kind of, maybe it's a little Swiss cheese here and there. It's like, what was that pie? I don't remember that. Maybe, but also there are gems within your family members. And it's about uncovering having those conversations. What did your parents think about as they were raising you? What did they really care about? What were they focused on? What did they worry about? What did they love? These are the kinds of questions that I do during these legacy interviews. And I'll tell you that the podcast, I didn't know this separate outcome of the podcast was going to be this treasure for the families. Jay Williams, he's on ESPN. He played for the Bulls and Duke, and he's just awesome. I interviewed his mom for the podcast, and he called me afterwards, and he was like, Megan, I've never heard my mom talk about these things. I never have heard her. This is such a gift for our family. I never asked these questions. I never thought of asking these questions. Thank you. Like, this means so much. And that was early on. And I was like, oh yeah, like that is a gift, because these questions haven't been asked. Yes. And it's, for me, it's so awesome. The other part of it that I love is we're giving a spotlight to these legends in our family who have done it. If you have a close relationship with your parents and you are an adult, your parents win. Like, they win the lottery of being awesome parents. Like, and that's what those of us that are parents, like, that's what I hope, that when my kids are 40, they want to talk to me and hang out with me. And I do with my mom, and it sounds like, you are thinking of your parents right now because you care for them. And that's part of who they raised you to be. Even though you are grown and you have your own grown children, like, that still goes back to your parents in a way, and how they raised you. And so it's really about what I love. The legacy interviews are about honoring your family and honoring your history, and then pulling some of these facts out, because how cool would it be if you could hear your grandmother talk about your mom? How cool would it be to hear, like,
that would be really cool.
Like, oh, well, when she was little, she did this. And then what if that's what you did too? Like, it's just, it's these magical, like, treasures that are buried that don't normally get uncovered. And I have absolutely loved doing these interviews. And even the ones that are not for my podcast, that are just for these families, it's so cool, because you hear these things come out and you're like, this is going to be so cool for their family forever. And it's priceless. It is priceless. Amazing. And it's really, honestly, celebrating those relationships and celebrating the people in your life that have been there all along the way. And I love getting to honor that and celebrate that.
And I think understanding the qualities that got handed down to you that make you an awesome person, like to the example you were using, like, I don't think we give enough credit to the environment and the people that raised us. And I know some people listening to this are probably maybe had horrible upbringings, but there's always a thread, a gem in there that made you who you are today.
Mhm.
So what I'm kind of curious, what kind of questions are you asking the on the legacy interviews? And honestly, I want to have you do both my parents and my husband's parents. I told my husband about what you were doing for Jesse's group, and he's like, "Oh my God, we need to do that." And but yeah, wait till you meet my parents. Like they'll they'll be your best friend. They'll have you over. Like pretty soon, you'll be sitting in their house, talking about life with them because that's how they are. But what kind of questions are you asking, and what kind of answers are you hearing?
Yeah, I love it. And I will tell you, to your point about some houses not being like a happy house, the other thing I've loved is like the legacy interview could be with an aunt or with a teacher, or like, I think it can come like, sure, it's great if it comes from your parents and if you had that traditional, like wonderful thing. But I also just feel like we all know well enough to know like things don't always fit in the box. So the legacy can maybe be coming from a next door neighbor that kind of raised you. Like that's still an important conversation, or an adoptive parent that came into your life later, or, there's just a lot of versions of this. And that's why I love that they're called legacy, because it's like a legacy can be left to anybody and it can be from anybody.
I love that.
Really the impact that it makes on someone's lives. But the questions I ask, so it kind of depends, and I customize it, of course, when I'm talking to these people, because if it's the other day I spoke to a couple that have been married for 54 years and they did it together. And so I was like, how did you meet? What was that like? And then hearing those stories, and what was it like? What did you do as newlyweds? And, so having those conversations, which of course, like their family hadn't had those, there's not normally what people sit around and talk about. Like, how did grandma and grandpa meet? Like, I mean, a little bit, but then like, what did you think when they got married, and what did you do? What did you guys do for fun as newlyweds? And, so we kind of will cover some of that, but then, a lot of it will be what did you focus on as a parent? What were you trying to instill? What characteristics did you see in your kids that stood out to you? Because and that's been really interesting from my podcast and the legacy interviews to hear so many of the things that are like, we know Jesse Itzler, we know Jesse to be this vibrant, energy filled person. Well, his mom shared a story that when he was in 6th grade, the teacher came in and said, "Everybody, we're going to have a spelling test." And he goes, "Excellent." And I was like, that's Jesse Itzler. Like,
yeah, that's totally him.
It's always been him, And so, but again, it's like that gift. So when Jesse hears this, he talked about how it was kind of emotional for him because he heard it from his mom in a different way. So we talk about those kind of things. I also talk about like, what was hard about parenting? What did you worry about? Because I think it's also interesting to think some parents are like, I didn't really worry. And I think that's a gift to the next generation. Be like, okay, they didn't worry about me. And then some are like, I worried about, so you're constantly learning from them. And then we always, I always like to go into kind of advice. And sometimes it's, what's your advice for your grandkids? What's your advice for any parents that are out there? And it's really interesting because I definitely let the conversation flow, because you never know where we're going to go. And
I'm sure.
And I want to let it ride and let it fly and see how it goes, and what's so awesome is, for me, I'm so curious because, I'm raising kids, and I also have parents that, have been amazing to me. And so it's all very, it's a natural place for me to be, because I'm so curious. And so sometimes the conversation kind of goes off, but those are some of the questions that we go with. And then, the questions vary, the answers vary so much from,
right. Oh, I'm sure,
from their experiences. But at the end of the day, what's so cool is it's so fun. It is such a fun experience, because we're really celebrating that relationship and the life's work that person has put in, and that's fun.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I mean about this new experience that I'm having as an empty nester, is it's like, okay, that was my life's work for the last 22 years. And on some sense, it's done, but it's not done. And then I have this really weird experience where I'll have an interchange with, and maybe just because it's mother-daughter, but I'll have this interchange with my daughter. And then an hour later, I'll have a phone call with my mom. And I feel like the pattern in the relationship is very similar. And it's like, whoa, this is really weird. The other day I was talking to my daughter and I caught myself in the middle of talking to her. And I'm like, I was kind of nagging her. I'll just be really honest. I was like nagging her. And I said something to her and I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I just sounded like my mom right now. I'm going to need to get off the phone. And then and she laughed. And then I got off and I'm like, oh my God, like I'm turning into my mom. And there was initially sort of a negative, like feeling like I'm turning into my mom. But if you met my mom, you would be like, what an amazing human. So what is it that and I hear a lot of people say this, like, do you have any insight of why we don't want to turn into our parents many times, even though there were so many gifts that they gave us?
Yeah. You know what? I think we always, we hold our parents to a different standard than what we hold anybody else to, I mean, from the time we're kids, we're like, you can't make a mistake. You told me to always do it this way. So you can't step out of line, And so then when we do, or when you see your parents do it, it's like the reaction is just like how, or super annoyed or, so I just think we hold parents to our own parents to a different standard. Because to your point, Dr. Mindy, I bet your friends love your parents. And I bet
everybody loves my parents. They're always like, your parents are so great. I'm like, ish.
Yes. And it's because, but if they weren't your parents, you'd be like, oh no, they're like so awesome. They're, and so I think it's one of those just like human nature things where I think we do hold our family and certain people to a different standard. Probably the same is true with your kids. Like probably if your child ever stepped out of line, I know this is true for me. If it was my friend's kid and they did something, I'd be like, oh, I mean, it's fine. But it was my kid. I'm like, you are never going to do that again. Like it's this. So I think there's something about being closer to home. You feel like you're in a safe place with them. And I think sometimes that's almost like showing that like, this is my safe place. And I hear that all the time cause I've got young kids, like that's their safe place where they can act out. My kids are perfect angels at school. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But like, then why do they do this at home? And that's their safe place. It's where they can just like let go and let loose. And, but I think also as we get older, it's important to like, we're in charge of redirecting that narrative so that it's not a negative thing to turn into our mom or, and I'm in that same place where I will have that same knee-jerk reaction. And I'm like, my mom's happily married. She's got 3 kids that love her and she's fulfilled and golfs 5 days a week and she's retired. Right. Like, I think that's a pretty great place to be.
Yeah. Why wouldn't I want to connect with an amazing woman like that? Yeah.
What's wrong with that? So I honestly think I love that you asked that question because I think it's one of those things that for all of us, we could kind of check ourselves and be like, should we maybe not have that knee-jerk reaction? And I think it's probably a practice all of us could probably get better at, but I also think it's super natural. And, I think everybody does it.
Yeah, agreed. And well said. I remember one time, my husband was out of town. My son must have been in elementary school. It's like 3rd grade. And I just had been home with the kids for 3 days straight. I was exhausted and he was acting up. And a friend said, why don't you just drop him off at the house and let me, I'll take him off your hands and you can get a little rest. Well, when I picked him up, she was like, oh my God, he was so great. He did this, he did that. And I thought, well, why wasn't he with that way with me? And she turned around and said, well, that's because he feels 100% safe with you. And so he knows you're not going to leave him. So he's going to act in all the ways that he knows to act. Whereas with me, he doesn't know if I'm going to walk out the door. He doesn't know if I'm going to do something that is going to make his afternoon difficult. And it was a really pivotal moment because I realized with family, just in general, I mean, I'll say this with siblings, I'll say this with my parents, that I'm having an awareness to be my best self, not my worst self with them. And I think when we get around family, we kind of just get like, blah, here I am, here's all of me, and you're irritating me. But when you go back and you look at the importance of these relationships on our health and happiness, I feel like we need to really be conscious to show up as our best self.
I could not agree more. I could not agree more. And I'll tell you, even doing these interviews, I think it's added a little bit of an awareness to the families that all of a sudden you're like, oh, somebody's celebrating that person in our family. Well, normally they're not really celebrated all that much. They're like, they do so much, the matriarch or the patriarch of the family, they've done so much. And by the time we're kind of recognizing it, Well, they've been 70 years into it. Like,
Right.
for me, it was really when I had kids, that I recognized so much that I had missed in my life, which I think is, again, normal. But
Right.
then I think the responsibility, to your point, the responsibility is on us once we recognize that. Like,
Yep.
okay, I can show up differently. I can have a different level of respect or understanding or sympathy, or maybe I don't go right back at them for a comment that they made, when if it were anybody else, I would, have a little bit of grace. I would give a little
Right.
bit of grace. And it seems like sometimes we don't give our family the grace that we give so many other people. But highlighting these parents and doing these, whether it's the podcast or legacy interviews, highlighting them has I've noticed people just kind of are like, oh yeah. And then they kind of have a different level of appreciation when they recognize what their parent is still capable of doing to this day. I mean,
Right.
they're still so wise. It's been just such a treat.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, it's got to be really fun to be on your end of the interviewing process. The other thing that I would say is, I've heard Jesse say this before, because he's got one parent that has Alzheimer's, and then he's doing an amazing job taking care of his mom. And I heard him I don't know if it was on an Instagram or somewhere, he mentioned that he calculated how many potential visits he had left with his parents. And he's like, if you see him once a month and they're going to live another 5 years, this is what you have left with them. Mm-hmm. And I never thought about that. I mean, again, my dad's 86, my mom's 82. And I never put their life in perspective of, I'm only got a handful of interactions left with them. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, it totally changes the way that you approach that relationship. Are you seeing, as you go through these legacy interviews, that the people that have the greatest connection with their aging parents are putting in extra time, creating rituals around their connection with them? Like, what habits can we form with our aging parents that will strengthen that relationship so we feel really good and complete when they pass?
Such a great question. That whole thing that the first time I heard that too from Jesse, I was like shook. I was like,
yes,
oh my gosh, but it's true. Like, it was nothing. It was very true. It's like, you have this many more visits with them. And so rituals, that was gonna, you took the words out of my mouth. That is one of the major things. There's a lot of Sunday meals, or this is when we always do this. And then so getting together regularly is something that a lot of them do. For those that aren't around, a lot of them do trips. Like we do this trip this time, and we always go here it's a very thoughtful, mindful connection that the family continues to have. And I think we all know that life gets busy. Life gets crazy. You've got kids, they have schedules, you've got school. It's all those things, like you were talking before, like your schedule is so all consuming. The families that I have interviewed, they're doing life together. So, whether that's, a lot of it has been also like, probably the grandparents of the world are going to be like, don't say that. But there've been a lot of caretaking, like the kids are with the grandparents, the kids they drop them off to go, they spend a lot of time together. Yes. And like I said, even the ones that are apart, they have, I mean, I've been on, I can't tell you how many interviews where I'm like, well, we're not together, but we're actually meeting together next week. Like, it's so crazy to me, because it's the time together. The time together is absolutely one of those things. And I think that can happen, with a weekly dinner, that can happen with little babysitting moments here and there, that can happen with trips. I think it depends on, of course, the dynamic of the family. But that time together is key. And then I honestly think, it comes with a level of respect that you have for those relationships.
Yes.
So you have to prioritize the relationship, and the relationships I have seen have all been prioritized. The mother and the child, the father and the daughter, the father, like the parent and the child relationship has been a priority. Even when the child becomes a mother, that's still a relationship that is prioritized. The grandparents prioritize their relationship with the grandchildren. Yes. And also what's happening is the grandchildren are seeing the priorities of their parents and their grandparents. And then that's continuing on for generations. So when there's an 80-year study and you think, what's been passed down? Well, the thing that those relationships, that's what's been passed down. the connection between the different generations.
Yeah.
And that's been a key for every interview.
I feel like I'd love to like have this conversation like 3 years from now after you've done like a whole nother set of interviews. But I'm curious if different cultures prioritize aging parents different. I feel like in our family, both sets of parents were really intimately involved when the kids were little and a part of their lives. And then there's sort of becomes this moment where you don't need them to babysit anymore. You don't need them to like help you out. And so it shifts. And so you have to come up with new ways to connect with them, new ways to pull information out of them. Do you think our culture, and I have a worldwide audience, but I'm just going to say, do you think here in America, we don't prioritize the wisdom of aging parents enough?
I would say my knee-jerk reaction would be that's probably fair, but I would say my experience is that's not the case. So the relationships that I have, but keep in mind, I'm seeking out parents, or I'm seeking out interviews with people that their child is like the goal, you know? And so I haven't been, and so I think the thread is that maybe they are honoring their parents, and that's a part of why their children become fulfilled and happy adults. Those are the people I'm targeting. And that's what I have seen time and time again across all different, backgrounds and cultures. I interviewed, Ramit Sethi. He's a well-known, financial advisor on Instagram, and he's got books and he's awesome. His mom was in an arranged marriage, and they've been married for 50 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And it was one of my favorite interviews because I was like, they started as an arranged marriage and then they came over from India. Like she met him and then they got married. Like it was unbelievable. And it was, their relationship. It was still prioritizing the relationship and how they raise their kids and the respect that their children have for them to this day was similar to what I've seen Jesse's respect for his mom and Sarah and, your respect for your mom. So I think part of it is that is the answer. That is the key. That is what is so powerful. I don't know that I would say across the board that we do that, better than another culture. So your point, like I have got some more work to do to be able to pinpoint that. But I would say I see it in all the interviews that I've had is that there is that honoring of the parents. I think honestly, the legacy interview highlights it even more because no one really is asking these questions or putting the spotlight on the parent, which everybody can. Like you can take these questions I've thrown out and go and sit down and record this conversation for your parent.
Right.
But I have seen that when there is that respect for the parent and for who they are and what they've done, the outcomes are wonderful.
Yeah. Amazing.
And
that when you respect something, you prioritize it.
Exactly. Whether it's your health or your business or your family. I mean, it's absolutely your intention of where are you putting your energy, your focus, your love, your care.
Yeah. I had a fun experience. So we've done the Sunday night thing forever. And the general rule, the way I was raised was Sunday night dinner was the time for the family. You had to be there unless you were out of town. And your friends could come. You just couldn't go to another house. Like you needed to be home with the family on Sunday night. We played cards. We did things like that. So we reproduced that in our family. And, whoever's listening, if you don't do Sunday night dinner with like the family, I highly recommend it. It is such an anchor for the family. Well, so my kids have really interacted with my parents quite a bit. And the other night we were celebrating my daughter's 22nd birthday and we were out to dinner. And my son is a freshman in college. So he decides to come. We're like, will you come? It's like all exciting that he's going to like actually leave his dorm room and come out with us. So he comes out and there's this sweet moment where I look over and my 86-year-old dad is like leaned in and I can see my son telling him a story. And I caught it on camera. I actually put it up on my Instagram because I know exactly what the conversation was. My dad, honestly, he wanted to know what it was like to be a 19-year-old frat boy college guy. And my son was telling him, and the joy in both of their faces, I had to capture it on camera. I was like that. I mean, my dad was living vicariously through my son, which was just mind blowing.
And what is more powerful than that? Like that,
Yeah.
the human connection, the memories that your son will have from that, the joy that it's bringing your dad in the moment and the fun. And then who knows what he can say to your son then as a way to relate or not relate,
Yep.
or, it's just, to me, it's those moments being able to be like, that's what it's all about. That's it. Like that is the purpose of life, I mean, and honestly, to your point, like with the Sunday dinners, like you prioritize that relationship for your son and for your dad by continuing that. And that was a conscious decision that you made to say, we're going to keep doing this, because I'm pretty sure you're a busy lady. Your family's busy. You probably didn't feel like, let's add, you could have very easily not done that and nobody would have faulted you, but your priority was the people and the relationships in the life. And then you're giving that gift to your kids, I mean, and frankly, the truth is you're giving that as a gift to your later self.
Yeah, I was just thinking
you're going to reap the benefits of that down the road, that they're going to care about that.
Oh my God, I just thought of that. You're right. You're modeling for your kids. This is how I want you to take care of me at 80 years old. I never even thought about that. That's brilliant. What have you noticed about conflict? Because the other thing is, I always laugh. My sister is 2 years older than me. And there are moments when like the four of us will get together and we just go right back into, my sister and I go back into our teenage selves. Like everybody operates in these weird places in the family. What have you seen as far as either from talking to the parents of successful people or the legacy interviews? How are people handling conflict and not letting it get in the way of the relationship?
Well, I'd say it's in every one of the relationships, and that it's a part of life. And so, I am there. I really am highlighting the great parts, but it inevitably comes up in every one, like the hard times, the challenging times, when the kids were fighting, when they were punching each other in the back seat, like how to, or when there were drug issues or somebody gets in jail or whatever. And it's interesting because what the tone of the parent who is, later in life, a lot of times it's like, and then you love them through it and you get through it. And it's never this heavy moment from the parent. Which I think it's interesting because I take that perspective, because I think when you're in it, like where I am in my life with a 3 or 5, 7, and 9-year-old, I'm so in it that sometimes that those bad moments feel really heavy. What's helped me is seeing these interviews. And of course, when you're out of it and it's a retrospective look, you can be lighter with it, but no one has been like, I wish I would have been harder. I wish I would have made everything more intense and more serious and heavier and harder. And I wish I would have been harder on my kids. No one has ever said that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I've metabolized the conflict conversation is, everybody talks about moving through it in their own way. They don't quite say it that way, but they all kind of were like, and then they grew out of it, and then we talked about it. And, and sometimes many of the parents have been like, I had expectations and they didn't meet them. And so there was a consequence, and it's a very just kind of matter of fact, but it's just moving through it. And and that's helped me, to be honest, when I'm in those moments where it feels heavy, that I just remind myself, no, we're going to move through it. And this is for parents that have had kids struggling with drugs or struggling with grades or struggling with, those kinds of things, not small things, but no one really feels like they wish they would have carried it heavier, if that makes sense. Right. They all kind of just feel like they move through it and they continue to love. And some of them have still, had some issues here and there, because we're human and, not everybody, the greatest decisions aren't always made, but everyone just continues to love their kids through it and move through it. I would say keeping kind of that momentum going forward and knowing you can't get stuck in those hard moments. That's what I see from the different interviews.
I will tell you, one of the biggest struggles I've had as a parent is, you look at a snapshot of where you are your child is in time. Mm-hmm. And if you don't like it, you're like, oh my God, if you don't get this under control, then this is going to happen. And then this is going to happen. This is going to happen. And as they get older, I really am a big believer in small kids, small problems, big kids, big problems. Like, yes. and the big problems are scary, like crazy scary. Mm-hmm. And then you have to like remind yourself that like, it's just a phase. But I think actually the older that my kids get, the harder, the more detached I need to become, because I future trip, if they don't get this under control right now, what's going to happen 5 years from now?
Yeah.
Whereas when they're 5, you're like, well, I still have time to like mold them. But when they're out of the house, that's a lot harder.
Yeah.
So have you seen any patterns where parenting shifts as the kids get older? Have you noticed that at all?
Yes, definitely. And that's actually, it's a question I end up usually asking at some point, like, when did that relationship shift, or how did that shift? And a lot of times the common answer is usually like marriage. When your child gets married, there's this kind of shift where you're like,
oh yeah,
okay, I am not your go-to anymore. I need to cleave totally. Like this cannot be my thing. And I think now I know as a mom, I'm like, I mean, you can say that and you need to step back, but our headspace many times will still be thinking all those things. But you need to give what one of the moms was talking about was like, she needed to figure out that space for herself and with her spouse. And I needed, we were best friends, and we are, but it's different and needed to be different.
Right.
And, and so that's been one of those things. And many of the parents though, it's amazing because they never, the parenting hat never goes off.
No.
At no point does it go off. It kind of adjusts a little bit. And marriage, that was the one that would come up, that was really when the shift happened for many of them, but it was hard. And many of them talked about that. Like that was a hard time for parents when they have to change that relationship. I mean, I can't imagine it. And so many times when I'm talking to them, I'm like, I got to come back later because I can't imagine how that feels when somebody that's known your child for 3 years comes in and then becomes the most important. Like what?
Right.
Right. Logically, I just can't get there. How's it going to feel, but it's like everything else in parenting, you just love your way through it. Like you just kind of keep moving through it. And that I a lot of times I will like to think about what's the alternative. Do you, like, what if you don't give them that space and let them have that? Then what happens if you remain in that place and that parenting role and it's not healthy then for your child as they go, they need to be able to stand on their 2 feet. And then I have also heard from many of them, then a new relationship blossoms. I never expected. I didn't see this coming. It's a different type of friendship more than this motherhood role. It's a little bit more of a friendship. And then many of them have said, and then they have kids and they come to me like I'm the most brilliant human being ever because I've done all this, and that's actually the relationship I had with my mom, where when I had kids, she was like, I've never been as smart as I was once you had kids. Then I became the smartest person you've ever met in your life. And I was like, oh, yeah. You're right. I didn't get it until I had kids. And then I'm like, tell me everything. What did you do? You're the best.
Oh, I've heard that from so many parents that when their child has a child, they're like, oh my gosh, now that child fully understands what's going on. We're having that experience in our own home, especially with our oldest. And my husband and I do this thing where we're like, what's happening? Like, who is this person? But we love what she's blossoming into. It's just where there might've been conflict before, she's now reacting to us differently. And we're like, wow, well, that was really nice. Like, we're not going to argue about this. This is amazing. So I do like this idea of it morphing and changing. And I want to like bring you back in a couple of years. I want you to keep, I know you're like a serial entrepreneur, and I want you to keep doing all of this because I'm also curious how the different generations respond to their families differently. For example, one of the more like, aha moments I've had interviewing people on this podcast was with an integrative cancer doc. And when I asked her, she has a beautiful clinic down in Southern California. When I asked her what she thought was what she felt was the fastest growing population of people getting cancer, she said the younger generation. And I said, why? And she goes, because they were not given the opportunity to create resilience on their own and solve their own problem. They have been raised with cell phones in their hand that they can connect with mom and dad very quickly. They can go on social media and connect to friends very quickly. So they weren't given the resilience. So when stress hits them, they actually are ill-equipped. So she's like, she said specifically 20-year-olds. I have 20-year-olds pouring in to my clinic now with cancer because they never created resilience.
That's unbelievable.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, that's really crazy. As you explain it, I'm like, that makes sense. They didn't ever have to like be like, my mom isn't here. I need to find a payphone. I need to find a quarter. I need to, you know, like all those things that even just like my generation. I mean, had to figure those things out. That's fascinating. Yeah, I'm not surprised by it. And I would say I have interviewed a mom who has younger kids now. She was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and she has, you know, was given less than 1% chance to live for 5 years. And I interviewed her, and she had just passed her 5 years. And I just texted with her last night, and she's doing, that's been, you know, another year past probably. Yeah. But most of the parents I've interviewed, their kids are older. So it would be interesting to see like that next generation. You know, I think the youngest is that mom who, but you know, they've obviously, her kids have developed a different type of resiliency because of what their family's going through.
But that's a whole nother, oh my gosh, that's a whole nother skill set that I don't know if your heart can take it, but interviewing people with terminal diseases.
So that's actually, we were talking before, like we kind of just build it on the fly. So one of the things I want to do is create a philanthropic arm of this, where I do talk to the moms with terminal diagnosis of some sort, to capture those feelings that, you know, before it's like, I'm on my deathbed, you know, before it's like the last moments, but like, let's just talk about like, what did you think as you were raising your kids? So this mom specifically that I interviewed, her kids at the time, she had one in high school and one in middle school. And I got to talk about like, what did you think about all these questions? What did you think about as you're raising your kids? How did you feel as a parent? Like, so that someday her sons are going to want to hear her having those conversations, and hopefully they hear it from her and everything works out. But even still, just to kind of feel like that mom or that parent can capture some of those feelings and emotions that you can only get direct from your mom or your dad, you know. So that's another thing that I want to pursue, because I know that if it were me, I would want to make sure that there's some messages that I can have on tap for my kids, you know, and see how that plays out.
Well, I can't wait to see where this goes for you. And I so resonate with I do the same thing when I have a passion about something. I just want to jump into it, and I'll build it along the way. So I'm going to keep fueling you with more information. And I largely because I feel like connection is so important. And if there's anything we learned from the pandemic, that lack of connection really ate people up emotionally. I mean, I remember one day my parents came over in 2021. So, you know, we'd kind of been out of the thick of the pandemic. And my dad just said to me, you know, we're lonely. Like, we don't have, our friend group has split apart. People are arguing over who they should go visit. And it was a really sad moment. And he said, I think our best friends right now are you and my husband. And it was a very sweet moment, but then it also reminded me the responsibility I have as a child of older parents in this day and age. Yeah. So I'm going to just keep encouraging you to keep doing what you're doing, whether you have time to do it or not.
I know. No, I love it. Well, I definitely want to interview your family, all of them. And I want to interview you for my podcast, because you've obviously raised amazing. So I'm like, I feel like we're leaving this conversation with many interviews ahead of us. Yes. For sure.
Well, So my next book, so the book that will come out at the end of this year is Fast Like a Girl. It's a fasting manual for women. Mm-hmm. The next book I want to do, and I'm actually currently researching it, I don't know how it'll unfold. I want to do something on the neuroscience of community and connection. Mm-hmm. When you go and you look at like nature, for example, like trees, like the roots of trees intertwine underneath the ground. And the trees actually will give extra energy to a tree next to it that might be dying. Okay. And there's so many examples of connection and how it makes us thrive. Yet to the beginning of this conversation, I feel like we are not prioritizing family. We are not prioritizing this kind of experience where we're talking to people from a heart-to-heart connection. We put those aside as they're frivolous, and I'll do them after I work. I'll do it after I, go to the gym, and they should be at the forefront of everybody's healthy lifestyle. So
I couldn't agree more. I was on a podcast talking about marriage. And he was talking about, I was reading this thing and it was an article that somebody had written about me. And at the end of it was talking about my marriage. And he was like, I just feel like it should be the first thing. And I'm like,
Yes.
I agree. When you hear about people, the first thing should be like the people in their life because that's the power, that's the source of energy. And back to the study that so brilliantly started this interview off with, because it goes back to the relationships and the people and those closest to you. It doesn't have to be all the people, but the people that are your people, your people that are close to you, and those relationships are so powerful. And I love having an opportunity to highlight those people for the other people in the relationship, because it's not something that is done a whole lot. And honestly, it's holding space for the people. It's holding space for people to be able to say, let's talk about you. Let's talk about what you've done and how you've done it and what the impact it's had. And that's just a special thing to do. And we can all do it. I think that's the other thing that I've recognized is everybody's capable of connecting with those members of your family and asking those questions. And what do people love to do? People like to talk about themselves.
Yes.
They like to talk about the things they've done. And especially as you get older, fewer and fewer people are asking them questions. Fewer and fewer people are seeking their insight. It's all there though. It's all there. And, so I would say one of the things I would love is for the people listening to do it for them, for their family, do it. You can do this. You can start having Sunday dinners. Call it the Pelz dinners on Sundays.
There we go.
Follow from you. And then when you're sitting at that table, don't just talk about what you're doing at work. Ask questions about the legacy that is your family, that has come from those members of the family. And then you're also setting yourself up for a great future because your kids are seeing the importance of family. So it's all.
I just love this conversation. Thank you for having it with me. It's so funny. It's a total different direction than we have done in the podcast. But as I was researching for the Fast Like a Girl, I found that study on community, because the one thing that's baffled my brain for a long time is why we do health in a silo. We should do health as a community together. And then when I started to think about that, I started to think more deeply about where are those relationships in your life that make you healthier? Mm-hmm. And if they're making you healthier, you should be prioritizing them. Mm-hmm. So I hope people gathered that from this conversation. So thanks. And I have two questions for you. So this is the third season of the Resetter podcast. And each season we kind of have a different theme. So this year it is gratitude, and really helping us all remember that to highlight what we're grateful for, not to look at the things that aren't working. So 2 questions. Do you have a gratitude practice? And if so, what is it? And what's something you're really grateful for in this day and age? Because it's very easy right now to look at all the things that are going wrong in the world. What's going right that you're grateful for?
I love it. So I do have a gratitude practice, and that is I send out 365 cards a year. So I send out handwritten notes. It's technically one a day, but I usually batch them. And it is my gratitude journal that I put out into the world. I do it to encourage people, to thank people, to let them know I'm thinking of them if they went through a hard time. And I have found it to be really impactful for myself, which I didn't see coming. But when I'm ticked off about something, I'm like, I'm going to go write some notes. And then you get out of yourself and you start to think about other people, and you start to think about their needs, their wants, what you can celebrate. So that is I've done it I actually started it because of Jesse and BYLR trying to do something, that was a new habit I wanted to do. And I was like, you know what, I needed to do it, but I didn't want to do like 10 in a month. I wanted to make it so it kind of felt like a bigger thing. And so I've done it for, it'll be 2 years this summer that I've done it. And I absolutely love it. And it's a joy for me. And then, that's my gratitude practice.
I love it. Yeah.
And then, thank you. And the thing that I am grateful for right now in this moment would be, I feel so grateful for the relationships in my life. I love my husband like crazy. And I feel like it's such an honor to raise human beings. And so as a mom, that is such a gift to think that I get to be responsible for these people and help them navigate life and celebrate who they are. And so, you know, in on the heels of this conversation, it's the relationships that I have in my life, specifically my husband, my kiddos. It's such a gift. And, you know, it's not always easy or perfect, but it's certainly a gift in my life that I'm grateful for.
You know, I have a new thought based off this conversation. I think when I meet somebody new from this point forward, I'm going to go straight instead of like, oh, what do you do? Or where do you live? I think I'm going to ask, tell me about the 5 closest people to you. What are those people like?
Yes. I love
Wouldn't
it.
that be neat? It's kind of like, have you ever gone into somebody's house and you look at their books because their books kind of tell you what they're thinking about?
Yes.
I think we should start asking about the closest relationships, and that'll give you a really deep insight into the person.
Yeah, while it's also putting relationships on a pedestal versus like your job. Like, I don't, you know, I mean, that's always the go-to. And it's like, what does that really tell you about somebody? I don't know. You know, I love that. I like that. It's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, Megan, this is awesome. How do people find you? You know, we were laughing just for you guys listening. We're laughing because this legacy interview is a new skill or a new venture you're on that Jesse really put you into, but such a needed one. So we're now going to say that you are launching legacy interviews.
Yes.
And your podcast, how do people find you, your podcast?
Yes.
So people can go stalk you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, my podcast is on Instagram. If you go at Who Is Your Mama Pod, that is me. It's MOMMA. It's always funny to like all the ways people spell mama. But I'm actually relaunching it, which is very exciting. So it will be available when people listen to this. My podcast will be on all the normal platforms. So that's exciting. And then I'm very active on LinkedIn. My business side of me comes out on LinkedIn. So Megan L. Reilly on LinkedIn there. And then whoisyourmama.com is where people can find out more about the interviews. And that's where people can get their own legacy interview scheduled. Right there on the Who Is Your Mama, Who Is Your Mama podcast or Who Is Your Mama website.
It was announced on the Resetter podcast. Boom. It's
I guess it's happening. Dr. Mindy said it was going to happen. Here it is. Legacy interviews coming to you today.